Next speaker is Dan Mitchell. Dan is a top expert on tax reform and supply-side tax policy. He's a strong advocate of flat tax and international tax competition. Prior to joining Cato, he was a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and an economist for Senator Bob Packwood in the Senate Finance Committee. He also served on the 1988 Bush-Quayle transition team and was Director of Tax and Budget Policy for Citizens for a Sound Economy. His articles can be found in such publications as Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Investors Business Daily, and Washington Times. He's a frequent guest on radio and television and a popular speaker on the lecture circuit. He holds bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from University of Georgia and a PhD in economics from George Mason University. Dan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Marian. Since my job is to talk about what the implications of Amity's book are, but also if you're commenting on a book, in theory, you should try to find something negative to say, even if it's constructive criticism. And that was very difficult. But Amity gave me an opening in her remarks. She made a mistake. She talked about IRAs being tax preferred. No, they're tax neutral.
Tax neutral.
IRAs are a way of avoiding and protecting people against double taxation. So I did find one that wasn't in your book, but it was in your remarks. So I did feel that I achieved that. Also, I have to make one correction on Marian's introduction. You say I'm a strong advocate of a flat tax. No, what I'm an advocate of is small government like we had during the Coolidge years when we were that close to having a government small enough that we wouldn't need any broad-based tax whatsoever. So I actually, unfortunately, when you work at the Cato Institute, you're not in control of the bio they put on your webpage. And I didn't think to have to remind Marian of my real views before he gave the introduction. But anyhow, let me go ahead. Before I talk about the implications and lessons that we should learn from the Coolidge era and from Amity's remarks, let me just make a few comments about the book, because it really is something that you should read. And of course, that means you should buy it as well, which I'm sure Amity would agree with. I do have one criticism of it, though, not in terms of what was in the book, but in the fact that I'm a creature of habit, and at night, I like finding an empty novel to read so my mind can wind down, because all day I have to read and write about serious things. And when I was reading this book in advance of this panel, what I would do is I would read it at home. And that was not good for me, because instead of falling asleep within 15 minutes by reading a novel that was empty, I'm sitting here, oh, what's on the next page? And reading about all these fights about how they got the tax cuts through in the 1920s. So it was not good for me getting a good night's sleep. Which, of course, is a compliment, because it's a very well-written book. It mixes the big themes with the small and interesting details of the time. It's a history book as much as it is an economics book. And one thing that definitely comes across for someone like me is Coolidge is the new Reagan, or Reagan was the new Coolidge, however you want to say it. But he very clearly had both for moral and economic reasons, he wanted better tax policy, better spending policy, better fiscal policy overall. And one of the fascinating things about reading the book is how intimately involved he was with planning what, from our perspective, would seem to be trivial micro details of the budget. But then as I thought about it, as I'm reading through the book and sort of getting this historical perspective, I realized, well, of course he was involved in these very small decisions about the budget, because government was very small at the time. So nowadays, with a $3.7 trillion budget in Washington, people by definition have to focus on really, really big numbers, and they can't even begin to get at the level of understanding how programs are managed and run. But when you have a very small government at the time, and you're working to make it smaller, then yes, you can focus on whether you're spending $100,000 here, or how you're managing this program, or conducting this activity of government. So a lesson to be learned is that if you want effective government, if you want well-managed government, it's a very good idea to have small government. One of the little anecdotes in the book that I enjoyed was where Amity writes about, Coolidge being against the idea of Congress being in session more because he thought it meant that they would do more. And that sort of struck a chord with me because I've often joked in my speeches that I would be happy to triple Congress's pay if they just promised to stay home all year. You know, if you're a libertarian, you have to assume that 99 out of 100 times if legislation passes, it's not going to be a good thing at all. As Amity remarked, Coolidge was sort of the original supply-sider, although Mellon was really the supply-sider, and Coolidge was approaching it more from I guess, a moralistic or preacher sense. But clearly, from reading the interaction of Coolidge and Mellon in the book, combined, however it worked out, whoever was driving it, they understand supply side in the right sense. You're lowering tax rates to boost incentives, not because you think someone should have more money in their pockets. They clearly understood the Laffer curve when art wasn't even a gleam in his father's eye. And as Amity said, there was definitely a starve the beast component to their analysis. They did not want to lower tax rates in a way that would give the government more money so that government could be bigger. They wanted to lower tax rates so you could somehow figure out what is the right level. And this is where the scientific taxation term, I guess, would apply. They were trying to figure out how low could you lower tax rates while still raising that necessary but very small amount of revenue for the government. Amity mentioned capital on strike. That definitely is something that comes across when you read the book. You want money to be used productively, and this is where a lot of the analysis of municipal bonds comes into play. We don't really think about it now. It's not a big issue in tax reform discussion. People focus on what about the mortgage interest deduction or the charitable contributions deductions or the healthcare exclusion, or what do you do about business taxation, depreciation versus expensing, and so on and so forth. Back then, a huge issue was municipal bonds because still as today, if you're a rich person, you can put your money in municipal bonds and pay a 0% tax. And back then, both Mellon and Coolidge were very concerned about, we don't want the productive capital of America being unproductive because it's tied up buying debt from state and local governments. You want it out there in private business investment. And that, unfortunately, is a lesson that seems to have been lost over the many years. Coolidge recognized that temporary tax cuts didn't deliver bang for the buck, so he had the wisdom to reject Keynesianism before Keynes even published the general theory. So again, the book is something you should read for both historical and economic knowledge and lessons. But let's now talk about those lessons. What can we learn about this scientific taxation approach from Coolidge and Mellon that should be applied today? Well, let's do a little bit of an analogy here. Let's pretend that you own a restaurant. And you're, of course, trying to figure out how to maximize the profit from your restaurant. Maybe you love being a cook, you love managing a restaurant, but also you want to make some money out of it. Would it ever occur to you, would you ever think, hey, I'm going to double the price of my hamburgers because that's going to give me twice as much revenue from hamburger sales? Unless you're a very incompetent business manager and restaurant owner, you're going to understand, well, if I double the price of my hamburgers, I'm probably not going to sell as many hamburgers. Now, maybe people will still come into my restaurant, they'll buy other things, but maybe I'll just drive them away from my restaurant altogether because they really like hamburgers and they're going to go someplace else. And that analogy could apply to automobiles, it could apply to anything in the economy, services, goods, you name it. You don't double the price of something and expect that you're going to double your revenue. But in Washington, at the Joint Committee on Taxation, at the Office of Tax Analysis, with a few little wrinkles, that's basically what they do with tax policy, with the revenue estimating part of tax policy. They assume there is a linear relationship between tax rates and tax revenue. Whereas if you want to do scientific taxation, nobody uses that term anymore, of course, but perhaps we should, what you want to do is factor in, yes, we have tax rates, yes, we have tax revenue, but there's another very important variable you want to include, and that's taxable income. Because if it turns out that changes in tax rates affect people's behavior, that's going to affect the amount of taxable income they declare, and that's going to affect the amount of tax revenue that the government can collect. I used to work for Senator Packwood many years ago, One of the things that Senator Packwood did is he sent a letter to the Joint Committee on Taxation asking what would be the revenue effect if you imposed a 100% tax rate on all income above $200,000 a year. And back then, instead of doing 10-year revenue estimates, I think they did either 3 or 5-year estimates. So the Joint Committee on Taxation gets back to him with a revenue estimate, and the numbers were basically the first year you'll collect $200 billion. And maybe that was right. You know, maybe they were looking at it the way Jerry Brown did with that new surtax they imposed. Hey, if we impose higher taxes on income people earned last year, there can't be any supply-side response. So maybe the $200 billion figure was right. But what shocked Senator Packwood was that in the second year, the Joint Committee on Taxation said, oh, you're going to collect $230 billion, and the third year was I think it was $263. But it's basically every year they were assuming revenue would go up $30 billion a year, in a system where every penny you earned above $200,000 would be stolen by the government. Now, ask yourself this. Who on earth would bother earning or reporting income over $200,000 a year? Nobody. So Senator Packwood sends a letter back to the Joint Committee on Taxation, and this wasn't exactly what he wrote, but he said, are you guys smoking crack? Did we even have crack back then? You're young and hip, Marion. You probably know about these things. But he basically said, are you guys crazy? Think about this and get back to me. You know, is this really the revenue number you want to stick with? So the Joint Committee on Taxation eventually gets back to the senator. New estimates, 200 billion, 230, 260, but there's an asterisk. And this was back when we used paper instead of computer, so you didn't scroll down a screen, you went down to the bottom of the page, you looked at the asterisk. Our model assumes that there are no changes to GDP, employment, and all these other macroeconomic aggregates. Now, Republicans, of course, subsequently took control of Congress in 1994 elections, and they ruled, with a little exception when the Democrats controlled the Senate for about a year or so, they ruled for 12 years. They left the system in place. And that's basically still the system we have today, with a few improvements. Now the Joint Committee on Taxation does a little bit of microeconomic dynamic analysis, but no macroeconomic dynamic analysis. So that's sort of the mess that we're in right now. So what does scientific taxation tell us? What should we learn? How should we change the current system? And I'll go ahead and close on this. I'm going to focus on taxes and the rich, because, of course, if you look at the president's budget, he's proposing more taxes on the rich after, of course, he already got some taxes on the rich as part of the fiscal cliff deal. And I think for the foreseeable future, that's where the fights are going to be. What do we know about the rich? Well, if you look at IRS data, and every year the IRS puts out something called the Statistics of Income. And let's look at one historical episode, and then let's look at some current data. The historical episode I want to give you isn't the 1920s. Amity's already covered that. I want to give us some historical numbers from the second coming of Calvin Coolidge, Ronald Reagan. In 1980, when Reagan took office, or when he was elected, didn't take office till 81, of course, but in 1980, we had a top tax rate of 70%. According to the IRS data, the amount of revenue we collected from those rich people making more than $200,000 a year was $19.7 billion. So let's think about this. 70% top tax rate, revenues of $19.7 billion. By the way, you see what I'm doing right here? This is called the Slovakian PowerPoint slide. Marion's from Slovakia, so he understands. So 70% tax rate, $19.7 billion of revenue from the rich. Reagan lowered that top tax rate all the way down to 28%. What happened to revenue from the rich? Did it go down to about $8.5 billion, a proportional reduction? Did it go down to $15 billion, implying that the tax cut more than halfway paid for itself? Did revenue stay at $19.7 billion or whatever it was, meaning that the tax cut fully paid for itself? What actually happened during the 1980s? Well, if we look at the 1988 Statistics of Income and look at the data, the amount of revenue collected from the rich, $99+ billion, more than 5 times as much revenue. Now, a couple of caveats are very important here, and these caveats would apply in the 1920s just like they would apply in the 1980s and today. There's a lot more to economic policy and economic performance than just fiscal policy. Amity already mentioned the importance of trust in a system. property rights, rule of law are different ways of saying that. There's also regulatory policy, monetary policy, trade policy. So we have no idea, if we're going to be honest, whether Reagan's lower tax rates on the so-called rich doubled revenue from the rich, tripled revenue from the rich. Certainly, they didn't cause the five-fold increase all by themselves. There were other economic reforms that probably were going to result in more rich people, more taxable income from the rich, and more revenue from the rich. But the Laffer curve worked. And now a lesson for today that I'll close on. If you look at the IRS data, the most recent data, what do we see about the rich? And let's think about this in the context of our own lives. I assume most of us in here are just ordinary working slobs. We get most of our income from wages and salaries, so-called W-2 income. If we're lucky, we have a little bit of savings. We maybe get some dividends and some interest. Maybe we get a capital gain. Maybe it's even significant one year in every 10 years or something like that. But for the most part, if our tax rate changes, we don't really have much ability to change our behavior. I mean, if Obama raises my tax rate, what am I going to do? Just hold my breath and sit in front of my computer screen and not work for an hour a day to protest? No, I don't really have much ability as someone with W-2 income to change my behavior when tax rates change. Sure, maybe I can decide I don't want to go out to the middle of Iowa in February to give a speech for $500 because my tax rate has changed. But my ability to have supply-side responses aren't significant. But what do we know about the rich? If you look at the IRS data, if you make more than $1 million a year, only 1/3 of your income is W-2 income. 2/3 of your income are from business income, capital gains, interest, dividends. What do we know about those sources of income? You have much greater control over the timing, level, and composition of your income when you can simply click your keyboard and change the composition of your investment. You can put it in municipal bonds if you want and change your federal tax rate to 0. What about if you make $10 million a year? What if you're a member of the super rich, the ultra 1%? Well, according to the IRS data, 81% of their income is non-wage and salary sources. So when you try to go after these evil, bad, rich people, what's going to happen? You're going after the very people who have the ability to put their capital on the sidelines, as was discussed in the 1920s. They have the ability to shift their investments and their economic activity in ways that dramatically lower their taxable income, and you wind up getting big supply-side Laffer curve type responses. So I guess the moral of the story is, from Amity's great book, is that the Laffer curve worked in the 1920s, it worked in the 1980s, and it would work today. But more important than that, because obviously the goal of economic policy should not be revenue maximization, the real lesson of Amity's book, the real lesson of the Coolidge years, is that a modest-sized government with reasonably low tax rates will give you the right fiscal policy to generate the prosperity that the country needs. Thank you very much.